A young billionaire saves a poor girl in the rain. The next day, he comes home and sees his wheelchair-bound son standing while the girl says, "Don't be afraid. I'm here. You can do it." He is stunned by what happens next. The rain pounded mercilessly, turning the streets into rushing streams. Brian squinted to see through the windshield while the wipers worked at maximum speed, barely managing to clear the water. The radio announced the worst storm in years. "Just a few more minutes," he murmured, exhausted after a long day at the office. Traffic crawled. Brian glanced at the clock, almost midnight. He had worked late, as he had been doing ever since the accident. Work was his refuge, a way to avoid the silence at home. His cell phone rang. It was Karen, the nanny. "Mr. Mitchell, everything's fine with Noah, but he's still awake. He seems uneasy because of the storm. I just wanted to know if you'll be long." "I'm on my way, Karen, maybe another 10 minutes. Hanging up, Brian thought about his son. Would Noah really be asleep, or just pretending the way he sometimes did? Since the accident, Noah lived in his own world. The doctors said it was normal, that trauma required time. But how much longer? The traffic light turned red. Brian slowed down. And that was when he noticed movement on the sidewalk. Something small, almost invisible under the torrential rain. He leaned forward, frowning. The headlights revealed a tiny figure huddled against the wall of a closed shop. What the? There was no doubt. It was a child. A small girl, sitting alone on the sidewalk, completely soaked, visibly shivering. The light turned green. Cars behind him honked. Brian ignored them, turned on his hazard lights, and pulled over. Something inside him, an instinct that had seemed dormant for months, flared up like an alarm. He jumped out of the car and was immediately hit by the force of the rain. "Hey!" he shouted, running toward the girl. "What are you doing out here alone?" She didn't respond. As Brian approached, he saw she was holding an old teddy bear, just as drenched as she was. Her eyes lifted, and he felt a chill. Those eyes seemed to carry far more than any child should. "Where are your parents?" he asked, looking around. The street was deserted, except for the passing cars. The girl just looked at him, silent. "You're freezing," Brian said, placing his coat over her shoulders. "Come on, you can't stay here." The girl did not resist when he picked her up. She was so light it made Brian's chest tighten. She showed no fear, which was both comforting and unsettling. Inside the car, Brian turned on the heater. The girl clutched the teddy bear tightly as water dripped from her hair. "What's your name?" Brian asked. The girl hesitated. "Emily," she finally said in a low voice. "Emily, that's a pretty name. I'm Brian. Where do you live?" She squeezed the bear and lowered her gaze. Brian realized he wouldn't get easy answers. "Are you lost?" Emily didn't reply. She just kept trembling. Brian thought quickly. The girl was drenched and freezing, and something about her expression deeply unsettled him. "Let's get you dried off and warm first. Then we'll figure out where you live." He called Karen. "I'm going to be a bit late. I found a situation. Could you prepare a hot bath? And maybe set aside some of Noah's clothes?" He hung up before the nanny could ask questions. Looking at the small, silent passenger, Brian questioned his decision. Taking a child he didn't know back to his house was not standard procedure, but something about this felt meant to be. "Do you like soup?" he asked. Emily nodded slightly. "Great. Karen makes the best vegetable soup." They drove in silence. When he finally parked, Brian took a deep breath. His home, a large brick house, seemed far too big, too empty, ever since the accident. "We're here," he said, more to himself than to her. He lifted the girl into his arms and hurried to the porch. Karen opened the door, her expression shifting from curiosity to surprise. "My goodness, who—" "Emily," Brian answered. "I found her alone in the rain. Is the bath ready?" Karen nodded. "Yes, in the guest bathroom. I picked out some of Noah's clothes." "Perfect. Could you take her? I think she'll be more comfortable with you." Karen held out her arms, and Emily went willingly. She seemed numb. "Emily, Karen will take care of you now. She'll give you a warm bath and some dry clothes. I'll make something for you to eat." The girl looked at him with those deep eyes and nodded. It wasn't just fear or confusion in her gaze. There was something else, like an understanding no child should have. While Karen led Emily away, Brian went into the kitchen and put the soup onto heat. His mind raced. Calling the police was the right thing to do. But something stopped him. Maybe it was the late hour, maybe the storm. Or maybe he had a feeling that this child had crossed his path for a reason. Brian found himself staring at the photo on the fridge. Him, Rachel and Noah, all smiling at a picnic. It had been taken the previous summer, before the accident, before a drunk driver turned their life upside down. The sound of footsteps pulled him out of his thoughts. Karen walked into the kitchen with Emily. The transformation was remarkable. Clean and dry, her fair hair still damp, and wearing Noah's blue pajamas, she looked like a different child. Only the serious expression remained. Behind them, almost hidden in the hallway, Brian noticed a small figure in a wheelchair. Noah was watching, curiosity shining in his eyes, his fingers lightly gripping the wheels of his chair the way he did when he was nervous or intrigued. "Noah," Brian said, surprised to see his son awake so late. "I thought you'd be asleep." "I heard noise," the boy replied quietly. His eyes locked on Emily, who returned his gaze with the same silent intensity. "This is Emily," Brian introduced. "She'll be staying with us tonight." Noah said nothing, just kept watching the newcomer with a mix of curiosity and caution. It was the first time in months Brian had seen his son show genuine interest in anything or anyone. "Are you warm now?" Brian asked. Emily nodded, her eyes scanning the kitchen carefully. "Good. The soup's ready." Karen helped Emily onto a stool at the counter, then turned to Brian. "What's going on? Who is this child?" "I don't know," he answered honestly. "I found her alone on the sidewalk in the pouring rain." "Did you call the police?" Brian hesitated. "Not yet. I thought I should take care of her first." Karen gave him a worried look. "Brian, you need to call. Someone must be looking for her." "I'll call after she eats." "Is Noah still awake?" Brian asked. "Yes," Karen replied. "He's in his room, looking out the window. The storm is making him uneasy." Brian served the soup and placed it in front of Emily. "Careful, it's hot," he warned. Emily picked up the spoon and started eating with surprising delicacy for a child. "Do you know where you live, Emily?" Karen asked. Emily kept eating in silence. "Where are your parents?" Brian tried. The girl paused briefly, staring at the soup, then continued eating without answering. "Is the soup good?" Brian changed the subject. Emily looked at him and nodded. It was the most expressive gesture she had shown so far. "Where's your teddy bear?" Brian asked. "I put it to dry," Karen answered. "It was soaked." Emily looked up, worried. "Don't worry," Brian said quickly. "It's just drying. You'll get it back soon." She relaxed and went back to her soup. "I'll go make up the guest room," Karen said. Left alone, Brian watched Emily, trying to understand her mystery. Who would leave a child alone in the rain? Why wouldn't she talk about her home? "Are you afraid of something, Emily?" he asked gently. The girl stopped eating. Her blue eyes met his. For a moment, he saw something there. Not exactly fear, more like resignation. She lowered her gaze and continued eating. Karen returned. "The room's ready." Emily had finished the soup and pushed away the empty bowl. "Want some more?" Brian asked. She shook her head. "Let's get you to bed, then." Brian held out his hand. After a brief hesitation, Emily took it. Together they walked upstairs. The hallway was long. The door at the end belonged to Noah. It was closed, as it always was at night. Karen led them to the smaller guest room. The bed was made, and Emily's teddy bear was resting on the pillow. When she saw the toy, the girl let go of Brian's hand and ran to the bed. She picked up the bear and hugged it tightly against her chest. "I thought she might like to sleep with it," Karen said. "Good thinking," Brian replied, noticing how much calmer Emily seemed. They helped her settle in. She lay down, her eyes heavy with sleep. "Good night, Emily," Brian said. "Sleep well. Tomorrow we'll help you get back home." Emily looked at him intently. Then, surprising them both, she spoke, "I don't have a home." Just 3 words, but they carried immense weight. Before they could respond, she closed her eyes, holding the teddy bear. Brian and Karen left quietly, leaving the door slightly ajar. "What do we do now?" Karen asked. "I don't know. I'll call the police, but—" He glanced toward Emily's room. Something is really off about this. At the top of the stairs, Brian noticed Noah's door was ajar, a faint light coming from inside. He approached and peeked through the crack. Noah was in his wheelchair by the window, watching the rain. Sensing his father's presence, the boy turned his head. His eyes quickly noted Emily, who was holding Brian's hand. "Noah, this is Emily," Brian said softly. "She's staying with us tonight." Noah didn't respond, but his gaze stayed on the girl, showing more interest than he had shown in anything for months. Emily returned his stare with the same intensity. For a moment, the 2 children just watched each other as if assessing one another. "Bedtime for everyone," Karen said gently. "You too, Noah. It's very late." Noah nodded reluctantly and wheeled himself away from the window, but his eyes still followed Emily as Karen guided her to the guest room. "Was he okay today?" Brian asked. "Same as always. Quiet. Did his exercises. Ate little." Brian nodded. That had been Noah's routine since the accident. A routine of silence and a sadness no child should carry. Back downstairs, Brian picked up the phone and dialed the local police station. "Oakwood Police Department." "Good evening. My name is Brian Mitchell. I found a child tonight." "Where?" "On Maple Avenue." She was alone, sitting on the sidewalk in the pouring rain. "And where is the child now?" "She's at my house. She was soaked and shivering. I couldn't leave her there." He heard the sound of keys clicking. "Name and age?" "Emily. She seems about 5 or 6. I don't know her last name." "Did she say where she lives? Where her parents are?" "No. She only said she doesn't have a home." "Your address, sir?" Brian provided his address. "Any signs of abuse?" "Not physically, but she's very quiet. There's something in her eyes." Brian couldn't explain it. "We're dealing with several incidents because of the storm. I'll send a patrol car as soon as possible." "Can you keep her safe until tomorrow?" "Yes, she's already asleep. An officer will contact you in the morning. I'll also notify social services." Brian hung up. A strange feeling washed over him. He'd done the right thing, so why did he feel as though he'd betrayed Emily? Karen yawned. "I think I'll head to bed unless you need anything else," she said. "Go ahead, Karen. You've done a lot today." Karen went to her room on the first floor. She had lived with them since Noah was born, becoming almost part of the family. After the call, Brian went upstairs again. Noah's door was shut now. He knocked softly. "Can I come in?" he asked. "Yes," came the quiet reply. Noah was in bed, but clearly still awake. His eyes shone in the darkness, reflecting the hallway light. "Can't sleep?" Brian asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. Noah shrugged. "Who is she?" "Emily. I found her alone in the rain. She doesn't have a home." Brian looked at his son, surprised. Noah must have overheard the conversation. "It seems she doesn't," he answered honestly. Noah was silent for a moment. "She looks sad," he finally said. Brian nodded. It was the longest observation Noah had made in weeks. "Yes, she does. We'll try to help her, okay?" Noah nodded and settled under the blankets. Brian kissed his forehead. "Sleep well, son." As he left, Brian realized something had changed. Normally, Noah shut down whenever there was a visitor in the house. But with Emily, he seemed different. There was a silent connection between the 2 children, something Brian couldn't fully understand, but that, for some reason, gave him hope. He returned to his room and changed out of his wet clothes. Lying in bed, he thought about the strange turn his evening had taken. What would happen in the morning? Would the police find Emily's parents, or discover she really had no home? If that were the case, what would become of her? Brian turned over, unable to sleep. For some reason, he felt Emily hadn't crossed his path by chance. He felt she was connected to the emptiness in his home, to Noah's silence, to everything that had been broken in their lives. Outside, the storm was easing. The pounding rain became gentler, like a lullaby. Cradled by that sound, Brian finally fell asleep, dreaming of blue eyes that held secrets and of possibilities he hardly dared admit to himself when awake. Morning arrived with a soft light filtering through the curtains. The storm had given way to a clear sky, as if all the cloud's fury had been just a distant nightmare. The house was quiet, except for the sounds coming from the kitchen, where Karen was preparing breakfast. Emily woke early. For a few seconds, she lay still in bed, trying to recall where she was. The room was cozy, unlike any place she had slept before. She hugged her teddy bear tightly, and then remembered the night before. The rain, the kind man, the big house, the boy in a wheelchair who watched her with sad, curious eyes. She got up slowly, still wearing the borrowed blue pajamas. She picked up her teddy and left the room, her bare feet barely making a sound on the hallway floor. She went downstairs cautiously, following the smell of pancakes and the low music coming from the kitchen. Karen had her back turned to the door, stirring something on the stove. Emily stood there quietly, unsure whether she should go in. "Good morning," said Karen without turning around, as if she had eyes on the back of her head. "Did you sleep well?" Emily nodded, then realized Karen couldn't see her. "Yes," she replied softly. Karen turned, smiling. "That's good. You must be hungry. Would you like some pancakes?" Emily nodded again, more emphatically this time. Her stomach growled, as if replying on her behalf. "Sit right there," Karen indicated, pointing to the kitchen table already set with colorful plates and a glass of orange juice. "Brian and Noah should be down soon." Emily did as she was told, climbing onto a chair with some effort. She placed her teddy bear on her lap and watched Karen work, flipping pancakes with a spatula and humming softly. There was something comforting about that everyday scene, something that made Emily's heart ache in a strange way. "Does your bear want pancakes too?" Karen asked, glancing over her shoulder with a kind smile. Emily looked down at her worn-out toy. "He doesn't eat much," she said seriously, "but he likes watching other people eat." Karen laughed, a light and pleasant sound. "He's a very polite bear," she commented. The sound of heavy footsteps announced Brian's arrival. He entered the kitchen already dressed for work, his hair still damp from the shower. "Good morning," he said, his voice carrying the fatigue of a restless night. His eyes landed on Emily and he smiled. "Did you sleep well, sweetheart?" Emily nodded, clutching her teddy bear closer. "Great," Brian said, sitting down at the table. "The police will come by later to talk about you. There's no need to be scared. They just want to help find a place for you." He hesitated at the last part, as if choosing his words carefully. "She's not going to an institution today, is she?" Karen asked quietly, placing a plate of pancakes in front of Emily. "No," Brian replied. "I spoke to them on the phone. The officer said, given the circumstances, they might let her stay here for now while they look for relatives. We have to go to the station later to fill out some forms, but—" He paused, looking at Emily, who was eating her pancakes slowly, as if savoring each bite. "It doesn't feel right to send her to a place full of strangers right now." Karen nodded, clearly relieved. Emily continued to eat, seemingly oblivious to the conversation about her future, though her eyes moved between the adults, alert. "What about Noah?" Brian asked, changing the subject. "Is he up?" Karen sighed softly. "Yes, but he doesn't want to come down. He said he's tired." She lowered her voice even more. "You know how he gets." "Some days are harder than others," Brian nodded, a shadow crossing his face. "I'll take his breakfast up to him then," he said, standing. "No need," Karen replied. "I finished helping him get dressed before coming to the kitchen. He said he just wants to be alone for a bit." Brian looked at the stairs, clearly torn between respecting his son's wishes and worrying about him. "All right," he finally conceded. "But I'll go up before I leave for work." The rest of breakfast proceeded quietly, only the clink of cutlery against plates breaking the silence. Emily ate slowly, her gaze occasionally drifting to the staircase, as if expecting Noah to appear at any moment. After eating, Brian went upstairs to see his son. Emily stayed in the kitchen, helping Karen clear the table with surprising efficiency for such a small child. "Would you like to draw for a while?" Karen asked while putting away the last dishes. I have some paper and crayons Noah never uses. Emily nodded. Karen retrieved a colorful box from a shelf and led Emily to the living room, where she spread some sheets of paper on the soft rug. Make yourself comfortable, Karen said. I'll finish up in the kitchen and then come back. Emily sat on the rug, crossing her legs, and began testing each crayon color on the paper. Soon she was completely absorbed, drawing with intense concentration. Brian came downstairs a few minutes later, his face showing a mix of worry and resignation that had become familiar in recent months. How is he? Karen asked softly, as Brian passed through the kitchen. The same, Brian said, sighing. He doesn't want to talk, doesn't want to come down. He just stares out the window with that empty look. He shook his head. The doctor said it's psychological, that physically he could be recovering better, but he'll get through this, Karen said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. He just needs time. It's been 8 months, Karen. Brian rubbed his face, tired. Sometimes I wonder if he'll stay in that chair forever, not because he can't walk, but because he's too afraid to try. They glanced into the living room, where Emily was still drawing quietly, unaware of their conversation. I have to go, Brian checked his watch. The social worker will come by around 5. I'll be back before that. After Brian left, the house settled into a comfortable silence. Karen finished cleaning the kitchen, then went to see how Emily was doing. The girl had created several drawings, colorful houses, trees, a blue sky with a big yellow sun. There was a peaceful quality to her pictures, a calm that contrasted with the circumstances that had brought her there. They're very pretty, Karen praised. Do you like to draw? Emily nodded, not lifting her eyes from the paper, where she was now outlining a brown teddy bear that looked just like hers. I'm going to take a snack to Noah, Karen said. Would you like to come with me? Maybe he'd like to see your drawings. Emily looked at her blue eyes thoughtful. After a moment, she gathered her drawings into a small stack and stood up, holding them against her chest like a precious treasure. They went upstairs together, Karen carrying a tray with milk and cookies. She knocked lightly on Noah's door before entering. The room was spacious, decorated in shades of blue and green. A small collection of toy cars rested on a shelf, along with children's books and a few action figures. A big bed with a planets and stars comforter took up one side of the room. On the other side, near the window, Noah sat in his wheelchair, staring outside with a distant expression. I brought a snack, Karen said cheerily, and a visitor. Noah turned his head slowly. His eyes fell on Emily, who was half hidden behind Karen, clutching her drawings. Hi, he said simply, without emotion. Emily made some very nice drawings, Karen continued, placing the tray on a small table. Maybe you'd like to see them. Noah shrugged, a gesture that could mean anything. Karen shot Emily an encouraging look, and Emily took a few hesitant steps into the room. I'll leave you two to talk, Karen said, stepping away toward the door. I'll be downstairs if you need anything. After Karen left, a heavy silence fell over the room. Emily stood there, holding her drawings, while Noah stared out the window again. Slowly, Emily walked to the center of the room and sat on the rug. She spread out her drawings in front of her and took a blue crayon from the pocket of the dress Karen had lent her. Methodically, she began drawing again as if she were alone. Noah watched her out of the corner of his eye for a few minutes. She worked silently, focused, occasionally switching colors. What are you drawing? He finally asked, his voice breaking the quiet like a pebble dropped into a still pond. Emily held up her sketch so he could see a house with a big tree beside it and 2 small figures under the tree. Who are they? Noah asked, pointing to the figures. Emily shrugged, as if the question didn't really matter. She set the drawing aside and took another blank sheet of paper, then slid it across the floor toward Noah. A silent invitation. Noah looked at the blank paper, then at Emily. He made no move to pick it up. Emily went back to her own drawing, creating new lines, crafting a colorful world in which she seemed to lose herself completely. Occasionally, she looked at Noah and patted the rug next to her, inviting him once more. The morning went on that way, in a sort of silent communication only children seem able to sustain. Emily drew several new worlds on the rug, while Noah watched from his chair, refusing to join but also unable to completely ignore her. Karen came up a few times to check on them, surprised each time to see Noah still in the room with Emily. Usually, after a few minutes with any visitor, he asked to be left alone. At lunchtime, Karen called the children downstairs. Noah refused, as always, preferring to eat in his room. Emily went down and ate quietly, her eyes often drifting to the staircase. After lunch, she returned to the living room and continued drawing on the rug. The afternoon passed slowly, the sun moving across the windows, casting golden patterns on the floor. Around 3 o'clock, to Karen's surprise, Noah appeared at the top of the stairs. Can I come down?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "Of course," Karen replied, trying not to show her astonishment. "Do you need help?" "No, I can manage." Noah maneuvered his wheelchair expertly onto the small home elevator they had installed next to the stairs. Once he reached the living room, his eyes immediately found Emily, still sitting on the rug surrounded by her bright drawings. He rolled up close, stopping a few feet away. Emily looked up and smiled, small but genuine. "Can I see your drawings?" Noah asked. Emily nodded, gathering some papers and handing them to him. Noah examined them silently, his face softening a bit. "They're really nice," he finally said, returning them. Emily picked up her teddy bear, which she had left on the couch, and, without warning, placed it next to Noah's wheelchair. Then she went back to the rug and resumed drawing, as if nothing had happened. Noah looked at the worn-out toy in surprise. It was clearly Emily's only precious possession, and she had just shared it, with no hesitation or conditions. Karen, watching discreetly from the kitchen, felt a lump in her throat. There was something deeply significant in that simple gesture. The girl who had nothing offering her only treasure to the boy who seemed to have everything, but had lost the most important thing. The afternoon went by in quiet companionship. Noah stayed in the living room, close to Emily, occasionally commenting on her drawings or just watching her work. He never tried to pick up the teddy bear, as if understanding it wasn't truly his, but a temporary gift of company. At 4:30, Brian came home from work, surprised and touched to find Noah in the living room. "Hey, champ," he said, trying not to show how much that simple change meant to him. "How was your day?" "Normal," Noah replied with a shrug, but his eyes were more alive than they had been in months. The social worker, a middle-aged woman named Mrs. Roberts, arrived promptly at 5. Brian greeted her and explained the situation, while Karen prepared snacks in the kitchen. Emily continued drawing, seemingly oblivious to the importance of the visit. The conversation in the dining room was formal but productive. Mrs. Roberts asked questions about Emily, about how Brian had found her, about the previous night. She took notes in a small notebook, occasionally glancing at the living room where Emily was now showing something in one of her sketches to Noah. "Given the circumstances," Mrs. Roberts finally said, "we can consider a temporary placement while we investigate further. There are procedures, of course, forms, an official home visit, background checks." "We'll do whatever is necessary," Brian said without hesitation. "She can stay with us as long as needed." Mrs. Roberts nodded, seeming satisfied. "She seems to be adapting well," she said, looking into the living room, "especially with your son." "Yes," Brian agreed, following her gaze. "It's odd, but somehow it feels right for her to be here." As the social worker was getting ready to leave, Emily stood from the rug and walked to Noah. They exchanged a few words the adults couldn't hear. Then, to everyone's surprise, Emily picked up the teddy bear, placed it on Noah's lap, and went upstairs. "Where's she going?" Mrs. Roberts asked, surprised. "I'm not sure," Brian answered, equally puzzled. Noah looked at the teddy bear in his lap, an odd expression on his face. Not exactly happiness, but something akin to resolution. A few minutes later, they heard footsteps on the stairs. Emily returned, carrying something in her hands. She walked straight over to Noah, her face serious and determined. "Why are you always sitting in that chair?" she asked, her clear voice cutting through the room's silence. Noah went rigid, his face closing off as if a door had slammed shut. The bear slipped slightly on his lap, but he didn't seem to notice. "Don't you like to play?" Emily pressed, stepping closer until she was right in front of him. He answered, his voice thick with long-suppressed emotions. "As if I could, I can't even walk anymore." There was so much pain in those words, so much repressed anger and frustration that the room felt suddenly colder. Brian took a step forward, ready to intervene, but Mrs. Roberts gently placed a hand on his arm to stop him. Emily did not step back. Instead, she held out her hand, her eyes shining with a serene certainty that seemed out of place in such a small child. "Don't be afraid. I'm here. You can do it." Noah stared at her outstretched hand as if it were something from another world. His gaze held disbelief, but also, for the first time in months, a spark of something Brian hardly recognized: hope. Slowly, as if guided by a force he didn't fully understand, Noah placed the teddy bear on the seat of his chair and gripped the armrests. Emily didn't move, her hand still extended, her eyes locked on his, radiating unwavering confidence. With visible effort, Noah began to stand up. His legs trembled under his weight, not from physical damage — the doctors had always said his main block was psychological — but from the deeply rooted fear that had kept him confined to that chair long after his injuries had healed enough for him to walk again. His hands gripped the chair so tightly his knuckles turned white. His face was taut with the strain, not just physical but emotional, the strain of confronting the fear that had consumed him since the accident. Inch by inch, he rose. His legs still trembled, but they held. He was standing. Brian felt his heart stop. Tears sprang to his eyes before he could hold them back, blurring his vision. His knees gave way, and he fell to the floor, though he barely noticed the impact, his mind overwhelmed by shock and emotion. "Noah," he whispered, voice breaking. The boy turned his head slowly, as if afraid any sudden movement might break the spell. His eyes met his father's, filled with surprise, fear, and a joy so intense it was almost painful. "Dad," he said, voice small and trembling, "I'm standing." Brian crawled across the floor to his son and wrapped his arms around Noah's legs, openly sobbing. Noah wobbled a bit but stayed upright, one hand still gripping the chair for balance, the other hesitantly touching his father's hair. Emily took a step back, watching with a calm expression. There was no surprise on her face, only a steady certainty, as if this was exactly what she had expected all along. Karen covered her mouth with her hands, tears sliding silently down her cheeks. Mrs. Roberts watched with wide eyes, her professional demeanor momentarily forgotten. "This is extraordinary," the social worker murmured, and it was. In that ordinary living room, on an ordinary afternoon of an ordinary day, something truly extraordinary had happened. A barrier that had seemed impenetrable had been broken, not by doctors or therapists, but by a small girl with eyes too old for her age and unshakable faith. Brian remained kneeling, clutching his son's legs, his body shaking with sobs. Noah, still standing, trembled with the effort but did not fall, and his eyes, for the first time in many months, were not empty. There was fear, yes, but also something else, a new beginning, a promise, the first ray of sunshine after a long and dark night of storms. In the waiting room of the doctor's office, Brian held Noah's hand firmly. The boy fidgeted in his wheelchair, his fingers tapping against the armrest. Since that extraordinary moment in the living room 2 days ago, when he stood up for the first time in months, something had changed. "Do you think Dr. Weber will be surprised?" Noah asked, looking at his dad. Brian smiled, ruffling his son's hair. "I think he'll be very happy. Almost as happy as I am." Dr. Weber was a pediatric neurologist who had been seeing Noah since the accident. At every appointment, he tried to convince the boy that his condition was mostly psychological, that his tests showed enough physical recovery for him to attempt walking again. But Noah always withdrew, refusing even to consider it. Until Emily showed up. The door to the office opened, and a nurse smiled at them. "Noah Mitchell, Dr. Weber will see you now." The office was bright and welcoming, decorated with children's drawings on the walls. Dr. Weber, a middle-aged man with a kind smile, stood to greet them. "Noah, Brian, great to see you," he said, shaking Brian's hand and winking at Noah. "How are things?" "Doctor," Brian began, struggling to control the emotion in his voice. "Something incredible happened. Noah." Noah stood up. The doctor's eyes widened, looking from Brian to Noah, "Is that true?" he asked, bending down to Noah's eye level. Noah nodded, a small smile playing on his lips. "I managed to stand up. By myself." "That's wonderful, Noah." The doctor didn't hide his surprise and delight. "What made you try?" Noah was quiet for a moment, as if considering the question. "Emily," he finally answered. "She said I could do it." "Emily?" "A girl who's staying with us," Brian quickly explained. "It's a long story." Dr. Weber nodded without pushing for more details. "Well, shall we do some tests then? See how much you can do now." The tests were simple. The doctor asked Noah to try standing again, holding onto the examination table. Brian helped him into position, and with visible effort, Noah stood up. His legs trembled, but he managed to stay upright for almost half a minute before needing to sit down again. "Impressive, Dr. Weber murmured, taking notes. "Really impressive." He ran a few more exams, checking reflexes, sensitivity, and muscle strength. Noah cooperated, a newfound determination shining in his eyes. When they finished, the doctor sat back in his chair, smiling at father and son. "Noah, what happened is extraordinary but not unexpected. As I've always said, your condition was primarily psychological. The accident created a mental block that kept you from even trying to walk again. The fear was so great that your body obeyed." "What happens now?" Brian asked, holding his son's hand. "Now there's every reason to be hopeful," the doctor answered. "With proper physical therapy and continued effort, Noah can regain a normal gait. It's not guaranteed, of course. The road will be long. There may be tough days, setbacks even. But it's possible. Very possible." Noah looked at his father, his eyes shining with something not seen there in a long time. "Hope. Can I really walk like before?" "You can," Dr. Weber affirmed. "It will take work. We'll start with therapy sessions 3 times a week. You'll have exercises to do at home every day. But yes, if you stay determined as you are today, I strongly believe you'll walk again." On the drive home, the car was filled with a different kind of silence. Not the heavy, sad silence that usually followed medical appointments, but a light silence, full of possibilities. "Dad?" Noah said, staring out the window. "Yes, son? I want to try walking a bit today, in the yard. Will you help me?" Brian felt his throat tighten. "Of course, champ. We'll give it a try." When they arrived home, Emily was on the porch with Karen, drawing in a notebook. Seeing the car, she looked up, her blue eyes alert. Noah asked his father to help him out of the car, leaving the wheelchair in the trunk. Brian complied, his heart racing. It was the first time Noah had requested that. With his father helping him balance, Noah took a few shaky steps toward the porch. Karen covered her mouth with her hands, tears in her eyes. Emily just watched, serene. "The doctor said I can learn to walk again," Noah announced, his voice steadier than it had been in months. "I'll do therapy and exercises. It'll take time, but it's possible." Emily smiled, a small but glowing smile. Her eyes met Noah's, conveying something words couldn't capture. "I knew it," she said simply. And in those 2 words there was so much certainty, so much conviction, it was impossible not to believe her. At that moment, under the afternoon sun, a new hope was born. Not just for Noah, but for all of them. The rest of the day unfolded in a quiet celebration. Noah tried a few more steps in the yard, always supported by Brian or Karen. His progress was small, but every inch gained felt like a miracle. Emily watched everything with her attentive blue eyes, a slight smile on her lips whenever Noah managed to move forward just a bit more. When evening came, Karen prepared a special dinner. The table felt livelier than it had in months. Even Noah joined in the conversation, talking about the exercises the doctor had recommended. Brian watched his son with eyes shining with pride and hope, a look Karen hadn't seen since before the accident. It was during dessert that Karen noticed something odd. Emily, usually quiet but observant, seemed distant. Her cheeks were flushed, and she had barely touched her chocolate pudding, normally her favorite. "Emily, are you okay?" Karen asked, gently touching the girl's forehead. "You're warm." Brian looked worried. "Let me see." He touched Emily's forehead as well. "Feels like you have a slight fever." Emily sniffled, and only then did they notice her red nose. "I'm fine," she muttered, but her voice sounded a bit hoarse. "I think you caught a cold," Brian said kindly. Not surprising after that heavy rain, Karen stood up quickly. "I'll make you some tea with honey, and we still have that children's cough syrup in the bathroom cabinet." Noah watched Emily with obvious concern. "Are you going to be sick for a long time?" he asked. Emily shrugged, small and tired. "I don't know." "It's probably just a cold," Brian reassured Noah, noticing his worry. "With some rest and care, she'll be better soon." Karen returned with the tea, and Emily sipped it obediently, taking small, cautious gulps of the warm liquid. "I think you should go to bed early tonight," Brian suggested. "Rest will help." Emily nodded without protest, another sign she wasn't feeling well. Normally, she tried to stay up longer, drawing or just being near Noah while he watched a movie. Brian lifted her in his arms and carried her to the bedroom. Karen followed with the thermometer and the syrup. Noah remained at the table, looking thoughtful as he watched them go upstairs. In the bedroom, Brian helped Emily change into pajamas while Karen prepared the medicine. The thermometer confirmed a fever of 100.8 Bati, 38.2. Mild, but still concerning. "It's just a cold," Karen reassured, carefully measuring the dose of syrup. "But we'll take good care of you." Emily took the medicine without complaint, then lay down, letting Brian tuck her in. Her eyes, usually so vivid and alert, were now dull with fatigue and fever. "I'll stay until you fall asleep," Brian said, sitting on the edge of the bed. Emily closed her eyes, only to be interrupted by a soft cough. Karen brought a glass of water, which she sipped in small gulps. "Thank you," she murmured, her voice small. There was a sound at the door, the distinctive squeak of wheelchair wheels on the wooden floor. Brian and Karen looked over, surprised to see Noah there. "Noah?" Brian asked. Noah entered the room, skillfully maneuvering his chair. On his lap was his favorite blanket, the one with planets and stars he'd had since he was little. He rarely let it leave his own bed, treating it almost like a protective talisman. "I brought this," he said, extending the blanket to Emily. "It's warm. It always makes me feel better when I'm sick." Emily looked at the blanket, then at Noah, a surprised expression softening her pale face. "I hope you get well soon," Noah continued, his voice low but resolute. "I want to play with you." For a moment, no one spoke. Brian felt a lump in his throat, and Karen pretended to fuss with something on the bedside table to hide her tears. Emily took the blanket and clutched it to her chest, her eyes meeting Noah's. "Thank you," she said, a faint smile on her feverish lips. Noah nodded, satisfied, then backed his chair away. "Good night," he said, heading toward the door. Brian looked at his son, a wave of love and pride nearly overwhelming him. This was the Noah of before, the gentle, caring boy who had seemed lost after the accident. Somehow, Emily, with her quiet presence and inexplicable faith, was bringing him back. Once Emily finally fell asleep, Brian tucked Noah's blanket around her, noticing how she held it tightly even in slumber. That simple piece of cloth, loaded with meaning and affection, seemed more powerful than any medication. Emily's fever didn't subside overnight. In fact, it rose slightly, worrying Brian enough to call the pediatrician first thing in the morning. The doctor assured him it seemed like a common cold, but recommended careful observation and suggested bringing Emily in for a visit if the fever lasted more than 2 days. Karen prepared a light soup for lunch and took it upstairs on a tray. Emily managed only a few spoonfuls before leaning back against the pillows, exhausted by the simple effort of eating. She slept most of the afternoon, still clinging to Noah's blanket. Noah spent the day alternating between his strengthening exercises and frequent trips to Emily's room to check on her. Though she slept most of the time, he would sit quietly in his wheelchair by her bed for a few minutes, watching her breathe before leaving silently. By late afternoon, the fever dropped a little. Karen applied cool compresses to Emily's forehead and gave her another dose of medicine. The girl woke up, her blue eyes clearer and more alert than they had been that morning. "How do you feel?" Karen asked, helping her sit up. Better, Emily replied, her voice still hoarse but stronger. Do you think you can eat a bit more? I made vanilla pudding. Emily's pale face lit up slightly. Yes, please. While Karen went down to get the pudding, Brian appeared at the door, back from work. He had left early, worried about the little girl who was ill. Hey, sweetheart, he said, entering the room. Karen says you're feeling a bit better. Emily nodded, sitting up against the pillows. Noah's blanket slipped a little, and she pulled it back up. Do you like Noah's blanket? Brian asked, sitting on the edge of the bed. It's warm, Emily replied. And it smells like Noah. Brian smiled. It was such an innocent observation, yet so profound. Children notice things adults often overlooked. It was a very special gesture of his, Brian commented. He doesn't lend that blanket to anyone, not even me or Karen. Emily smiled gently, her fingers tracing the printed planets on the fabric. The social worker called today, Brian said after a moment. The temporary guardianship process is moving along. Soon you might be able to stay with us officially, at least for a while. Emily looked at him, her large, serious eyes on her small face. Do you want me to stay? She asked directly. The question caught Brian off guard. There was so much maturity in those 5 simple words. At first, he admitted, choosing honesty, when I found you out in that storm, I only planned on letting you stay for one night. I thought it would be best for everyone. Our house hasn't been a very happy place since the accident. Emily listened silently, without judgment. But then, Brian continued, his voice softening, you brought something into this house that I thought we'd never see again. Something no amount of money could ever buy. What? Emily asked, curious. My son's smile, Brian said, feeling emotion tighten his throat. I don't know how, Emily, but you reached him in a way none of us could for months. You brought him back to us. Emily looked down, gazing at the blanket as if absorbing his words. So, yes, Brian concluded, I really do want you to stay with us. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that comes when important truths are shared, a necessary space for the words to find their place. Emily, Brian began gently, you've never told us about your life before, about your family. The girl kept her eyes on the blanket, her fingers going still. You don't have to talk if you don't want to, Brian added quickly. But sometimes sharing sad stories makes them a little lighter. Emily took a deep breath, a soft sound that carried a heavy burden for her small shoulders. I lived with my mom, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. In lots of different places. Brian nodded, encouraging her to continue. We had an apartment first. It was small but nice. My mom put flowers on the windows. Her eyes were distant now, seeing a past Brian could only imagine. Then my dad found us. He used to yell a lot. He'd hit my mom. She paused. Sometimes he hit me too. Brian felt his heart tighten. How much pain had this small girl already endured? One night my mom took our things and we ran away. After that, we never stayed in one place for long. It was always just a bit longer, Emily, and then we'd leave again. She spoke with a simplicity that made the story even more heartbreaking. There was no self-pity in her voice, just the plain facts of a reality she had accepted. Sometimes we slept in shelters, other times on stairwells or park benches if it was warm. My mum always said she'd find a good job and we'd have a real home again. Emily looked out the window, where the sky was beginning to darken. Last winter was really cold. My mum started coughing. She said she was fine, but she wasn't. One night we slept under a bridge. She hugged me to keep me warm. Emily's voice faltered a little. In the morning, I tried to wake her, but she wouldn't wake up. Brian felt tears burning in his eyes. He wanted to scoop Emily into his arms, to shield her from a world that had already taken so much from her. But he respected her space, letting her finish. Some people came and took my mom away. They tried to take me too, but I ran. She always told me to be careful with strangers, especially those in uniforms. How long were you on your own? Brian asked gently. Emily shrugged, a small, sad gesture. Not sure. A lot of days. I knew how to ask for food. My mom taught me to be polite, so sometimes people would give me sandwiches or fruit. What about your teddy bear? A small smile appeared on Emily's lips. My mom gave it to me on my birthday. She said it would protect me when she couldn't. Silence filled the room again, heavy with the weight of her revelation. Brian tried to imagine this tiny girl, alone on the streets for weeks, maybe months, carrying only a teddy bear as a link to a lost love. That rainy night, Emily continued, it was so cold. I thought maybe... She hesitated. Maybe I'd see my mom again. Brian couldn't hold back his tears any longer. They slid silently down his cheeks as he held Emily's hand. Then you showed up, she finished, looking at Brian with those eyes that seemed to hold all the world's wisdom and pain. Just then, Karen appeared at the door carrying a tray with pudding. She paused, sensing the intensity of the moment. I'll come back later, she whispered. Brian shook his head. No, it's all right. Emily needs to eat to get strong. Karen entered and set the tray on the bedside table, glancing curiously between them. I'll let you eat, Brian said, standing up. Rest some more. Call us if you need anything. Emily nodded, her eyes now on the pudding. Brian left the room with a heavy heart, yet also strangely relieved. Emily's story was tragic, but knowing it made even clearer what he needed to do. She had lost everything, her home, her mother, her safety. He couldn't restore what she'd lost, but maybe he could offer her something new, a new family, a new beginning. And perhaps in doing so, his own broken family might find healing too. 3 days later, Emily had fully recovered from the cold. Her cheeks had regained their color, and that quiet yet constant energy was back. During her recovery, Noah stayed by her side whenever possible, bringing her books, sharing his favorite cartoons on the tablet, or simply keeping her company. The social worker, Mrs. Roberts, had returned for a follow-up visit. She was visibly impressed by Noah's progress. He could now stand for several minutes and even take a few tentative steps with crutches. More impressive was his change in behavior. The withdrawn, silent boy had become more talkative, his eyes shining with a determination that hadn't been there before. The temporary guardianship process is almost complete, she told Brian after her visit. Emily can officially stay with you for the next 6 months, while we continue searching for relatives. If none are found during that time... She paused meaningfully. Could we request permanent custody? Brian finished, hardly daring to voice the hope that had been growing in his heart. That would be a possibility, Mrs. Roberts confirmed, but let's not rush. 6 months is a long time. Brian nodded, understanding her caution. But as he observed the 2 children through the living room doorway, Noah trying to balance on crutches while Emily sketched on the rug, occasionally looking up to give him a smile, he knew time wouldn't change what he felt. Emily was already part of them. It was a Saturday morning, and the sun poured generously through the living room windows. Karen had gone out to visit her sister, who lived in a nearby town. Brian worked on his laptop at the kitchen table, occasionally glancing at the children in the living room. Noah's therapist had progressed him from crutches to a cane in recent days. The physical therapist, who visited 3 times a week, was impressed by Noah's rapid improvement. It's more mental than physical, he'd explained to Brian. Noah's muscles have always been capable of supporting him. What was missing was the confidence, the will to try. Now Noah was practicing walking circuits around the living room with his cane. Emily sat on the couch, counting aloud as he completed each lap. 16, 17, watch the rug, 18. Noah was sweating, his face taut with effort, but there was a determined sparkle in his eyes that Brian hadn't seen since before the accident. 19, 20, Emily exclaimed, clapping her hands. Noah stopped, leaning heavily on the cane but smiling proudly. I did it, he panted. 20 laps. I only did 17 yesterday. You'll get stronger every day, Emily said with that serene certainty that seemed far too mature for her age. Noah limped over to the couch and sat down beside her, breathing deeply as he rested his legs. They were silent for a moment, Emily doodling in her notebook while Noah watched. What are you drawing? He finally asked. Emily turned the notebook for him to see. It was a simple but expressive sketch. 2 children holding hands in front of a big house, with a tall man beside them. That's us, she explained. You, me, and your dad. Noah studied the drawing for a long moment, his fingers lightly tracing the figures. "It looks like a real family," he said quietly. Emily regarded him with those penetrating blue eyes. "It could be," she replied simply. Noah looked at her, a hint of vulnerability in his expression, as if he wanted to say something important, but feared rejection. "I really like you, Emily," he finally blurted, the words rushing out. "I wish you were my sister." "For real?" The silence that followed felt significant. Brian, who had stepped into the kitchen doorway to check on them, froze. He didn't want to interrupt that moment, but he also couldn't bring himself to leave. Emily looked at Noah, her face serious yet soft. "I like you a lot too," she replied. "I've never had a brother before." "It's good," Noah said, sounding more confident now. "We can do stuff together. I'll teach you to ride a bike when my legs get better, and we can play video games. Have you ever played video games?" Emily shook her head. "I'll teach you, then," Noah promised enthusiastically. "It's really fun, and you can teach me how to draw." "Your pictures are so good." Brian felt a lump in his throat. It had been so long since he'd seen Noah like this, excited, talking about the future with hope instead of resignation. It was as if a light had turned on inside the boy, a light that had gone out the night of the accident. He slipped away quietly, returning to the kitchen table. The tears on his cheeks were, for once, tears of joy rather than pain. The rest of the morning passed peacefully. Brian made sandwiches for lunch, and they all ate together on the back porch, enjoying the pleasant sunshine. Noah talked about a book he was reading, and Emily listened intently, her eyes hungry for details of a normal life she'd never known. "Do you think I can go back to school soon?" Noah asked, looking at his dad. "If you keep progressing like this, I don't see why not," Brian replied. "Maybe not full days at first, but we could start with a few classes." "Can Emily come too?" The question caught Brian off guard. It was something he'd thought about, of course, but hadn't yet discussed fully. "Emily's never been to school," Noah explained, noticing his dad's hesitation. "She told me her mom taught her things at home, but she's never sat in a classroom with other kids." Brian looked at Emily, who kept her eyes lowered, a slight blush coloring her cheeks. "Would you like to go to school, Emily?" he asked gently. She lifted her gaze, a mix of hope and apprehension in her eyes. "Can I?" "Of course you can," Brian answered, feeling his heart clench at the simplicity of her question. How many basic things most children take for granted had been denied to Emily. "As soon as the temporary guardianship paperwork is finalized, we'll enroll you. Maybe you and Noah can even attend the same school." Emily's face lit up with a smile so radiant it completely transformed her usually serious features. For a moment, Brian glimpsed the child she might have been, happy, carefree, if life hadn't been so harsh. In the afternoon, Noah's physical therapist came for his session. He was a young and energetic man named Mark, who had a knack for turning exercises into games. This time, he brought a large ball. "We'll work on balance today," he explained, placing the ball on the living room floor. "You're going to sit on it and try to keep your balance while I count to 10. Noah eyed the ball apprehensively. "Won't I fall?" "I'll hold you at first," Mark assured him. "Then we'll reduce the support as you gain confidence." Emily, who usually just observed these sessions, approached. "Can I help?" she asked. Mark smiled. "Sure, you can stand on the other side and cheer Noah on. Sometimes having someone rooting for you makes all the difference." Emily positioned herself where Mark indicated, her eyes fixed on Noah with that characteristic intensity. "You can do it," she said simply. The session was a success. Noah managed to balance on the ball for increasingly longer intervals, always with Emily in front of him, sometimes counting out loud, sometimes just smiling in quiet encouragement. Mark seemed impressed not only by Noah's progress, but also by the dynamic between the two children. "You make a great team," he commented at the end of the session. "Emily, you have a knack for this. Maybe you should consider becoming a physical therapist when you grow up." Emily blushed, clearly pleased by the compliment. After Mark left, Noah was exhausted but satisfied. He refused the wheelchair, preferring to use his crutches to get to the couch, where he collapsed with a tired sigh. "I'm sore all over," he admitted. "But it's a good pain." Emily sat next to him, studying him with that gaze that seemed to see right through people. "You work really hard," she observed. "I want to walk again soon," Noah responded, "so I can do normal things again, like play soccer." "Yeah." Noah looked at his legs with a mix of determination and something else, something close to sadness. "If I hadn't asked my mom to pick me up that night—" He trailed off, biting his lip. Emily tilted her head, her eyes never leaving his face. "You think it was your fault? The accident?" Noah didn't answer immediately. When he did, his voice was so soft Brian, passing by the hallway, almost didn't hear. "If I hadn't called her to come get me earlier at my friend's house, if we'd left 5 minutes sooner or 5 minutes later." Brian stopped in his tracks, his heart clenching. He had never heard Noah speak about the accident this way. Therapists had hinted at a possible guilt complex, but Noah always clammed up whenever the subject came up. "It's not your fault," Emily said with such conviction her words practically carried physical weight. "It was the man who ran the red light." Noah looked at her, surprised. "How do you know?" "You talk in your sleep," Emily answered simply. "And your dad told Karen some things." At that, Brian entered the living room, unable to just stand by. He approached the couch and sat beside Noah. "Emily's right," he said gently. "You were never to blame, Noah." The boy looked at his father, tears suddenly shining in his eyes. "But if I hadn't asked her to come—" "A drunk driver ran a red light," Brian interrupted, squeezing his son's hands. "It doesn't matter if you'd been there 5 minutes earlier or later. He's the one who did something wrong, not you. Your mom wasn't at fault, and neither were you." Tears began rolling down Noah's cheeks. He lowered his head, shoulders shaking with sobs he tried to contain. Brian pulled him close, hugging him tightly. "For so long I thought—" Noah choked out against his father's chest. "I thought that if I hadn't asked her to come, she'd still be here." "I know," Brian whispered, stroking his son's hair. "I know, but it's not true. It was never your fault." Emily watched the scene quietly, her big eyes solemn. After a moment, she reached out and gently touched Noah's arm. "Your mom loved you," she said. "She'd be happy to see you walking again." Noah looked at her through his tears, then nodded slowly. "Thank you," he whispered. It wasn't clear if it was meant for Emily, his father, or both. They stayed that way for a long time. Noah curled up in his father's embrace, Emily sitting patiently beside him, her small hand still resting on his arm in a comforting gesture. It was as if a knot that had been inside Noah for months finally began to loosen. The tears flowed freely now, washing away months of buried pain, unspoken guilt, and unprocessed grief. When the sobs finally subsided, Noah looked exhausted, but there was a change in his expression. A lightness Brian hadn't seen since before the accident, as if a giant weight had been lifted from his young shoulders. "Is everything okay now?" Emily asked, her face close to Noah's. He took a deep breath and nodded. "It's better," he replied. "A lot better." That night, Brian lay in bed feeling a sense of relief so strong it was almost physical. How long had Noah carried that guilt? How had Brian not realized it? The therapists had suggested it, of course, but Noah always denied it, changing the subject. It took Emily, a child they'd known for barely 2 weeks, to bring that pain to the surface so it could finally be faced. Emily. That extraordinary little girl who had entered their lives like a silent ghost on a stormy night, and in such a short time brought so much healing, not just for Noah, but for the whole house. The walls that once echoed with Rachel's absence now vibrated with something new. Not yet joy, but hope, possibility, a future. In the next room, Noah slept deeply for the first time in months, untroubled by the nightmares that usually woke him. In the guest room, which was now officially Emily's room, the girl also slept, teddy bear pressed against her chest. The house was quiet, but it was no longer the oppressive silence of mourning. It was the peaceful hush of a home where healing had finally begun. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into 2 months. Fall was painting the trees red and gold, and a cool breeze replaced summer's heat. At the Mitchell house, other changes, just as deep, were underway. Noah now used the cane only for longer distances, and inside the house he could walk without support. His physical therapist called it a miraculous recovery, and suggested he could return to school after the fall break, starting part-time. Emily was officially under Brian's temporary care for over a month. The social worker visited regularly, always leaving with positive notes about how well Emily was adapting. She went to preparatory classes 3 times a week to catch up on her education before enrolling in formal school. Her teachers were amazed by her intelligence, saying she soaked up knowledge like a sponge. The house, once a place of oppressive silence, now brimmed with life again, occasional laughter, dinner table conversations, even small arguments. It pulsed with the normal rhythms of a home where people truly lived, not just existed. One Friday afternoon, Brian left work early. He'd spent the morning at his lawyer's office, reviewing papers, signing documents, asking questions. When he returned home, he found Karen in the kitchen baking cookies with Emily, while Noah worked on a complex puzzle in the living room, a gift from his grandfather. "I'm home," Brian announced, putting his briefcase on the table. There was a contained energy in him, an anticipation no one could miss. "You have a strange look on your face," Karen said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Did something happen?" "We can talk later," he replied, glancing at Emily happily licking a spoonful of cookie dough. "Kids, how about we go for ice cream after dinner to celebrate Friday?" The proposal was met with enthusiasm. Even Noah, who was more conscious of his pre-teen image these days, couldn't hide his smile. Dinner was lively, with Noah talking about the book he was reading and Emily sharing, in her succinct way, what she'd learned in class that day. Brian watched it all with a mixture of joy and something else, a quiet certainty, as if he had finally found his path after a long time lost. The local ice cream parlor was almost empty at that hour. They chose a table by the window and placed their orders. Emily, still discovering new flavors, spent several minutes deciding between strawberry and chocolate, finally settling on both. "Is it good?" Brian asked, watching her savor every spoonful like a treasure. She nodded, a chocolate mustache forming above her lip. "Very," she answered, her eyes shining. Noah ate his mint chocolate chip in silence, but there was a relaxed expression on his face that was becoming more common. Occasionally, he exchanged knowing glances with Emily, as if they shared a secret. When they finished, Brian suggested a short walk in the adjacent park. The evening air was cool but pleasant, and the path lined with old-fashioned lampposts gave the place a magical atmosphere. Noah walked slowly, using his cane but with firm steps. Emily stayed beside him, naturally matching his pace. They stopped at a wooden bench near a small lake. The moonlight reflected on the water, creating a second, shimmering moon. "I have something important to talk to you about," Brian said, more serious now. "Especially you, Emily." The girl looked up at him, her big eyes fixed on his face. "You know you've been living with us under a temporary arrangement," he continued. "Mrs. Roberts explained that to you?" Emily nodded slowly, something in her gaze shifting, a slight fear maybe, or apprehension. "Temporary guardianship lasts 6 months," Brian went on. "After that, it has to be renewed, or—" He hesitated, searching for the right words. "Or I have to leave," Emily finished, her voice so low it was almost inaudible. "No," Brian quickly corrected. "Not if that's not what we want." Noah leaned closer to Emily, as though trying to protect her just by being near. "Today I was with my lawyer," Brian explained. "We talked about something very important." He took a deep breath, looking kindly at Emily. "We're starting the adoption process." A hush fell over the small group. Emily stared at Brian as if she didn't fully understand what she'd just heard. "Adoption?" she echoed. "Yes," Brian said, a smile forming on his lips. "That means that, if everything goes well, you won't just be a guest or a child in temporary care. You'd be legally part of our family. Forever." Emily's eyes went wide, tears filling them until they overflowed, rolling silently down her cheeks. Her lower lip trembled. "Really?" she asked, her voice breaking with emotion. "I won't have to leave." Brian felt his heart squeeze at the vulnerability in that question. How many times had she been forced to move on? How many times had she lost everything? "Really?" he confirmed, his own voice now unsteady. "If you want that, of course." Emily didn't answer with words. Instead, She flung herself into Brian's arms, sobbing into his chest, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from a place within her that had never been fully expressed before. Noah watched, his own eyes brimming with tears. Then, with effort, he stood from his cane and moved closer, placing a hesitant hand on Emily's shoulder. "We'll be a real family," he said, his voice overflowing with joy. "You, me, and Dad." Emily lifted her tear-stained face from Brian's chest, looking at Noah through her tears. She reached out and pulled him into the hug. The three of them stayed that way for a long moment, a newly formed family, united not by blood but by something just as strong: love, choice, and the desire to belong. Winter was approaching, bringing shorter days and grey skies, but inside the Mitchell house, it felt like springtime. Since the talk in the park 3 weeks earlier, when Brian announced the adoption process, a new energy filled the home. Emily hummed softly while drawing. Noah tackled his exercises with renewed determination. Even Karen seemed lighter, as though the whole house were emerging from a long emotional winter. The adoption process was moving forward, despite the usual bureaucratic pace. Mrs. Roberts came weekly, bringing forms, doing interviews, gathering documents. Brian spent his evenings filling out paperwork and studying adoption laws. The final court date was scheduled for January down after the holidays. On a particularly cold November afternoon, Mark, the physical therapist, arrived for Noah's regular session. Lately, the focus was on walking without support. Noah could take a few steps alone, but still lacked confidence over longer distances. "Today we're going to try something different," Mark announced once the warm-ups were done. He moved the furniture aside, creating a clear path in the center of the living room. Brian and Karen watched from the doorway, as they usually did. Emily sat on the couch, a forgotten sketchbook on her lap, her eyes fixed on Noah. "I want you to walk from here to the other end of the room," Mark explained. "Without the cane this time." Noah looked at the open space ahead of him. It was about 15 feet, nothing before the accident, but now it looked like miles. His eyes widened, a mix of fear and challenge. "I don't know if I can," he murmured, biting his lower lip. "It's too far without support." "That's why we'll do it a bit differently today," Mark said encouragingly. He glanced at the couch. "Emily, could you help us?" The girl stood immediately, leaving her notebook aside. There was something about her posture, a readiness, a quiet certainty, that was striking, as though she already knew what Mark wanted before he said it. "What should I do?" she asked, her voice soft but firm. "I want you to stand at the other end of the room," Mark instructed. "Noah will walk toward you." Emily did as asked, moving to the far edge of the clear space. She stood there, small and determined, her gaze never leaving Noah's. The air between them seemed charged with something intangible, a silent communication that the adults could sense but not fully understand. "Now," Mark continued, "hold out your arms. Noah will focus on you and walk in your direction. When he's close enough, you'll grab his hands to help him finish." Noah looked apprehensive, but there was a glint of determination in his eyes that Brian hadn't seen since before the accident. He had walked distances like this before, but always with the cane and always with someone at his side, ready to catch him if he wobbled. "You can do it," Emily said simply, arms extended as Mark had directed. There was no doubt in her voice, just a calm certainty that seemed far older than her years. Noah took a deep breath. He used the cane to stand from the chair. Then, in a decisive move, he handed the cane to Mark. For a moment, he just stood there, swaying slightly like a young tree testing its strength against the wind. The first step was hesitant, his body tense, braced for a fall that didn't come. The second step was a bit firmer. By the third, his knees wobbled, but he stayed standing. "That's it," Mark encouraged. "Keep your eyes on Emily, one step at a time." Noah moved slowly, each step a small victory over fear, the trauma that had imprisoned his legs for so long. His face was tight with concentration, a fine layer of sweat forming on his forehead, despite the cold. From the doorway, Brian held his breath. Karen gripped his hand so tightly, her nails dug into his skin. The air in the room felt heavy with anticipation, as if everyone was suspended outside of time. Halfway across, Noah paused, his legs visibly shaking from the effort. For a moment, he seemed ready to give up, to return to the safety of the chair or the cane. Mark stepped forward, prepared to help if needed. But then Emily spoke. "Look at me, Noah," she said, her clear voice cutting through the tense silence. "You're almost there. Just a few more steps." There was something almost magical in the way her words seemed to calm the tremor in Noah's legs. He met her gaze, blue locked on brown, and something passed between them, a silent message no one else could fully grasp. Noah drew another deep breath and took another step, then another and another. Each step was slightly steadier than the last, as though he were relearning to trust his body with every inch gained. When he got within about 2 feet of Emily, his legs finally looked ready to give out, the sustained effort catching up with him. But Emily moved forward, holding out her hands exactly as Mark had shown her. Noah grabbed them, his fingers intertwining with hers like a lifeline in a stormy sea. For a moment, they stood like that, Noah and Emily, hand in hand in the middle of the living room, eyes locked on each other, as if the rest of the world had ceased to exist. Then Noah's face broke into a smile so radiant, so full of genuine joy, that it seemed to light up the entire room. It was the smile he had once worn, the smile Brian feared he might never see again. "I did it," Noah whispered, disbelief in his voice. "I really did it." It was as though a dam had burst. Brian felt tears roll down his cheeks before he realized he was crying. Beside him, Karen was sobbing openly, one hand covering her mouth. Even Mark, always so professional, had misty eyes. "I told you you could," Emily exclaimed, her own smile reflecting Noah's, her blue eyes shining with a mixture of joy and something that looked a lot like pride. Then Noah did something that surprised everyone. Still clutching Emily's hands, he took one more step forward and hugged her. It was an awkward embrace, his legs still unsteady, his balance fragile. But it was a hug, the first he had initiated since the accident. Emily hugged him back, her small arms around his waist, firm enough to help him keep his balance, gentle enough to show how much this moment meant to her, too. Brian approached, unable to just watch. He wrapped his arms around both children, tears flowing freely now. "I'm so proud of you," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. So proud." They stayed that way for a long moment, a small circle of love and triumph in the middle of the living room. Mark and Karen looked on in respectful silence, witnesses to a daily miracle, the kind that unfolds not with fanfare or heavenly lights, but with hesitant steps and intertwined hands. When they finally pulled apart, Noah was panting, his legs trembling from the sustained effort, but his eyes shone like newly lit stars. It wasn't just physical exhaustion. It was the emotional release of finally leaving behind a burden too heavy for him. "I think that's enough for today," Mark said, bringing over the cane. "You've exceeded all expectations, Noah." Noah accepted the cane, but he held it differently now, not as a permanent necessity, but as a temporary support, something that would soon be just a memory of harder times. "Next week," he said determinedly, glancing at Emily, "I'll walk around the entire block." Emily smiled, that serene, wise smile that seemed beyond her years. "I know you will," she said simply, and somehow no one in the room doubted her. That night, after the children went to bed, Brian remained in the dimly lit living room, gazing out the window at the stars that peeked through winter clouds. He thought about miracles, not the grand ones described in religious books, but the small ones that happen daily, when broken people begin to heal, when impossible steps are taken, when love emerges in the most unexpected places. He thought of Emily, that little star who had fallen into their lives on a stormy night, illuminating everything that had been dark. Somehow, this girl who had lost it all was helping them find what they thought was lost forever. And for the first time in a long while, Brian felt genuine hope for the future, not just for Noah, but for all of them. An unlikely family, bound not by blood but by something perhaps even stronger. The choice to walk together, one step at a time, holding each other's hands through storms and sunshine alike. Spring had arrived, bringing flowers, longer days, and a sense of renewal. At the Mitchell household, That feeling was even more intense. Noah was almost walking without his cane, except for longer distances. His doctors talked about a remarkable recovery, though there was still a road ahead. The adoption process continued its slow march through court dates, interviews, and endless paperwork. Brian navigated that bureaucratic sea with patience, knowing every form, every visit, every evaluation brought them closer to the final goal, making Emily an official part of the family. Emily was thriving. She had started attending regular classes at school since January, impressing her teachers with her intelligence and eagerness to learn. At home, she was more talkative, more expressive, though she retained that calm, steady aura she'd had since day one. One April afternoon, the phone call came. Brian was in the kitchen, getting dinner ready with Karen while the children worked on homework at the dining table. "Mr. Mitchell, this is Mrs. Roberts." The social worker's voice sounded different, lighter, almost excited. "Yes, Mrs. Roberts. Any news?" Brian tried to sound casual, but his heart sped up. Calls from her usually meant more documents, more requirements, more waiting. "I have very important updates," she said. "Actually, two. First, Emily's biological father has been located and taken into custody." Brian felt a chill run through him. Though he knew from Emily's stories the man was dangerous, the official confirmation was unsettling. "Arrested?" he repeated, lowering his voice so the children wouldn't hear. "Yes, for armed robbery and assault. The sentencing isn't final yet, but he'll be behind bars for quite a while." Brian processed the news, conflicting emotions roiling inside him, relief that the man no longer posed a threat to Emily, sadness for the harsh reality she'd faced, and a small, shameful sense of relief that this would likely help the adoption process. "And the second piece of news?" he asked. "The judge has finally approved the adoption process," Mrs. Roberts announced, clear satisfaction in her voice. With her biological father in prison and no other relatives found, she granted full adoption. "We only need one final hearing to formalize it, but that's basically a formality now." Brian felt his legs weaken. He leaned against the kitchen counter, momentarily unable to speak. "Mr. Mitchell, are you still there?" "Yes," he managed at last. "I'm just taking this in. This is amazing." "I know," Mrs. Roberts said gently. "In all my years as a social worker, I've rarely seen a case where a child fit so well into a new family. Emily needed you, and it seems you all needed her." After discussing a few practical details and scheduling the final court date for the following week, Brian hung up. Karen, who had overheard part of the conversation, looked at him expectantly. "It's official," he said, voice trembling with emotion. "Emily will be ours, legally." Karen let out a small cry of joy and hugged him. Brian returned the embrace, tears of happiness silently slipping down his cheeks. "We have to tell them," Karen said, stepping back. Brian nodded, wiping his eyes. They went to the dining room, where Noah and Emily were focused on their books. Noah was scribbling in a notebook, his tongue sticking out in concentration, while Emily read a hefty volume, her blue eyes darting across the pages with fascination. "Kids?" Brian called softly. "We have some news to share." Both looked up, curious. "I just spoke with Mrs. Roberts," he began, his voice catching slightly. "The adoption, it's been approved. Officially." For a moment, neither child moved. Time seemed to stand still in the bright, spring afternoon. "That means—" Noah was first to speak, eyes wide. "It means Emily is now officially part of our family," Brian finished. "Forever." Emily sat very still, her huge eyes locked on Brian as if trying to confirm it was real. "Forever?" she finally asked, voice barely above a whisper. "Not just temporary?" "Forever," Brian repeated, kneeling so he was at eye level. "You're a Mitchell now. Officially." Slowly, Emily's face began to transform, like a dawn breaking. First a sparkle in her eyes, then a tremble in her lips, and finally a smile so bright it seemed to fill the entire room. Noah, who was getting more mobile by the day, stood up without help. He walked over to Emily, a little hesitant but steady, and did something unexpected. He knelt beside her and wrapped her in a tight hug. "Now you're really my sister," he said, his voice brimming with joy. Emily hugged him back, her thin arms holding his neck tightly. Brian and Karen joined them, forming a circle of interlaced arms and hearts. In that moment, something was made whole again in the Mitchell home. The circle broken by the accident and the loss of Rachel was mended, not the same as before, never that, but in a new, unexpected, and perfectly right way. Outside, the spring sun lit the garden where newly planted flowers were beginning to bloom. Inside, a newly formed family embraced, celebrating not just the formal end of a process, but the true beginning of a shared journey. A new home, a new family. For real. Saturday dawned perfectly, as if the very sky wanted to join in the celebration. An intense blue, not a single cloud, and a gentle warmth that caressed without burning. Brian opened the windows, letting the May breeze enter freely, carrying the scent of garden flowers. Karen had arrived early, arms filled with shopping bags. In the week since the adoption was finalized, she had been secretly planning a party. A celebration, she told Brian, not only for Emily's official adoption, but also for Noah's remarkable progress. 2 new beginnings, she said, arranging colorful treats on trays. Both deserve to be celebrated. The living room looked transformed. Colorful balloons floated near the ceiling, tied in clusters at varying heights. Paper streamers in shades of blue and green, Noah's favorite colors, and pink and yellow, Emily's favorites, formed arches on the walls. A handmade banner with large, bright letters proclaimed, "Celebrating New Beginnings." On the main table, a feast of sweet and savory snacks awaited every child's dreams. Cupcakes decorated with sugar stars, bright cookies, heart-shaped biscuits, fun-shaped mini sandwiches, and 2 cakes in the center, one small and round, covered in chocolate icing with Noah's name on it, and another square with white frosting and pink sugar flowers bearing Emily's name. "Maybe I overdid it?" Karen asked, obviously proud of her work. Brian looked around, a wave of gratitude so strong it nearly overwhelmed him. "It's perfect," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Absolutely perfect." At 2 o'clock sharp, the doorbell began to ring. The guests arrived. Mark, the therapist who had helped Noah so much, Mrs. Roberts, looking more relaxed and smiling now that she wasn't on an official visit. A few of Brian's colleagues, 2 of Noah's school friends he hadn't seen since before the accident, and Emily's teacher, charmed by the quiet but bright girl. The children were upstairs getting ready. Brian had bought new outfits for both, a light blue dress with small embroidered flowers for Emily, and a shirt and slacks for Noah, who insisted he look nice, as he put it. When they finally came down, there was a moment of admiring silence. Emily, normally so reserved, glowed in her new dress, her hair adorned with a small flowered headband. Noah followed her, leaning slightly on his cane but with determination on his face and a smile that brightened his eyes. "Surprise!" everyone shouted when the kids entered the room. Emily's eyes widened at the sight of the decorations, the treats, the stack of gifts on a side table. Noah let out an exclamation of delight, moving faster to greet his friends, who were openly surprised to see him walking. The afternoon flowed in a series of perfect moments. Children playing in the garden, with Noah watching most of the time from his wheelchair, occasionally standing with help to take a few steps. Each one met with cheers and applause. Emily, initially shy around so many people, soon relaxed, especially after her teacher showed her a new book she'd brought as a gift. There were games and stories. The moment when Mrs. Roberts handed Brian a framed copy of the official adoption certificate, tears welling in his eyes. There was a spontaneous toast by Mark, lifting a cup of juice to 2 of the bravest kids he'd ever met. And there was laughter, so much laughter. The most precious sound to Brian, who for so long had lived in a house where laughter seemed forbidden. At cake-cutting time, Brian asked for quiet. The children stood behind their respective cakes, side by side, their faces lit by the small burning candles. "Today's not a typical birthday," Brian said, his voice clear despite the emotion. "It's a celebration of 2 new beginnings. Noah, who is taking his first steps again, facing every challenge with incredible courage, and Emily, who found a new home and family, but also gave us something precious in return. She helped us rediscover hope. The guests applauded. Noah, in a spontaneous gesture, put his arm around Emily's shoulders. She smiled that rare, luminous smile that transformed her solemn face completely. "Make a wish," Karen instructed. "Then we'll blow out the candles together." The children closed their eyes, their faces earnest with concentration. When they opened them, they shared a conspiratorial look. 1, 2, 3. Noah counted. Together, they blew out the candles, the tiny flames snuffed amid applause and cheers. The party went on until dusk, with children and adults enjoying every moment. When the last guest said goodbye, the house was a happy mess of gift wrap, deflated balloons and crumbs of cake. Emily and Noah, exhausted but radiant, fell asleep early, each in their own room but with doors open, a habit they'd developed as if to make sure the other was always close by. 2 new beginnings, Brian murmured to himself, tucking Emily in with a light blanket and adjusting Noah's pillow. And one for all of us. A year had passed, a year of small and large victories, of challenges overcome, of a family growing stronger day by day. The calendar now read late spring, almost summer. The city park was at its peak, lush trees, vivid flowers, a calm lake where ducks glided lazily. Brian spread a checkered blanket on the soft grass, choosing a spot with partial shade, perfect for a family picnic. From the wicker basket Karen had prepared before leaving to visit her sister, he pulled out sandwiches, tuin, fruit, homemade cookies, and a bottle of juice. "Dad, look!" Emily's excited voice came from across the field. She was on the swings, her now longer fair hair flying in the breeze as she pumped higher and higher. "I'm almost touching the sky," Brian grinned, watching the girl who, just a year ago, barely spoke above a whisper. Emily still retained some of that calm maturity she'd had from the start, but now she also radiated a spontaneous joy, a lightness only children who feel truly safe can show. "Be careful not to really fly away," he called back, feigning concern. Emily laughed, that clear sound still making Brian's heart clench with gratitude. Beside him, Noah walked slowly across the grass, his steps still a bit tentative but strong. He no longer used a cane for short distances, though he kept it handy for longer walks. "She's not scared of anything," Noah commented, watching his sister soar higher. "I think she's had enough fear for a lifetime," Brian replied, draping an arm around his son's shoulders. "Same as you." Noah smiled, leaning slightly into his father. At 13, he was showing signs of adolescence, a taller frame, a voice that occasionally cracked, a bit of awkwardness about public affection. But today, on this perfect sunny day, he seemed relaxed, content to just be a boy enjoying a family picnic. "Emily, Noah." "Time to eat," Brian called, finishing the picnic setup. Emily jumped off the swing with a graceful leap and dashed over. Noah followed at his own pace, steady but cautious. Reaching the blanket, he sat with a satisfied sigh, stretching his legs. "Tired?" Brian asked. "A little," Noah admitted. "But it's that good kind of tired, the one that means I'm getting stronger." Brian nodded understandingly. Noah's therapy sessions had tapered to once a week, and he was attending school full-time now. His friends had adapted to his new reality, and though he couldn't play soccer as before, he'd discovered other interests: chess, photography, and recently swimming, which the doctor recommended to strengthen muscles without impact. "Can I take a picture of you guys?" Noah asked, picking up the camera he'd received on his last birthday. Photography had become a passion for him, a way to document his new life and capture the beauty and joy he'd once thought he'd never feel again. Brian and Emily drew closer, smiles at the ready. The click of the camera froze the moment. Emily with cookie crumbs at the corner of her mouth, Brian's arm around her shoulders, sunlight forming a golden halo around them. "Now it's your turn," Brian said, taking the camera from Noah. The siblings posed side by side. Noah draped an arm across Emily's shoulders. She rested her head against his. There was a harmony between them that surpassed words, a bond Brian watched every day with wonder. "Say family," Brian prompted. "Family," they chimed in unison, grins lighting up the frame. The picnic continued in a comfortable mix of conversation and companionable silence. Emily talked about her school project on stars, her eyes shining with enthusiasm. Noah showed off recent photos, including a striking shot of the sunset from his bedroom window. After they ate, Noah lay down on the blanket, gazing at the occasional clouds drifting across the blue sky. "That one looks like a dragon," he said, pointing. Emily joined in, lying next to him. "And that one looks like a ship," she added, "like in the pirate stories you tell me." Brian watched them, marveling at the simple depth of that moment, how life could change so drastically in such a short time. Some days he still woke up almost disbelieving the journey they'd taken, from the depths of grief to this bright day with his children laughing. The future no longer a dark horizon, but a path lit by possibility. "What are you thinking about, Dad?" Noah asked, noticing Brian's thoughtful expression. "About how lucky we are," Brian replied honestly. "How life can surprise us sometimes. Like when you found me that rainy night," Emily asked, her serious blue eyes suddenly profound. "Exactly," Brian said. "That night, I only meant to help a lost child in a storm. I never imagined I was finding a missing piece of our family." Emily smiled, still with that quiet wisdom in her gaze, but now blended with the sweetness of childhood. "I found you too," she said simply. The rest of the afternoon was a succession of small joys. Emily returned to the swings. Noah photographed butterflies landing on nearby flowers. Brian took it all in, storing each moment in his memory like a priceless treasure. As the sun dipped low, painting the sky in orange and pink, they gathered their things and strolled back home. Emily skipped a few steps ahead, occasionally pausing to wait. Noah walked beside Brian, his pace careful but more confident each day. "You know," Noah said suddenly, his voice thoughtful, "I used to think our family was broken forever. After the accident, after Mom, I thought we'd never be happy again." Brian looked at his son, his chest tightening. "I felt that way too, Han, for a while," he admitted. "But we're not broken," Noah continued. "We're just different, and maybe even stronger in some ways." Brian stopped walking for a moment, gazing at the teenager beside him. When had his son grown so wise? "I think you're right," he finally said. Family isn't something rigid or fixed. It adapts, grows, changes. And sometimes," Noah added, glancing at Emily, who had come back to hold his hand, "it shows up in the most unexpected moments." Together, the three continued toward home, their footsteps at different rhythms but perfectly in sync in their own way. The setting sun cast long shadows before them, three silhouettes, hand in hand forming a new constellation. The journey hadn't been easy. There would still be challenges, hard days, painful memories that sometimes resurfaced. But in that moment, walking under a sky gradually filling with stars, Brian knew deep in his heart that they would be all right. Because family isn't always about blood. Sometimes it forms in the most unlikely moment and lights everything up again. Spring was in full bloom, the days stretching toward early summer. Noah was nearly walking without the cane, using it only on rough terrain or longer walks. Emily was thriving in school and had made new friends. Karen was practically family, enjoying the lively household that had once been so quiet. And Brian found himself waking each morning with a sense of gratitude he'd never known before. Life was not perfect. There were still echoes of the past, fleeting moments when sadness threatened to darken the horizon. But the house that once felt haunted by absence was now filled with shared laughter, small triumphs and quiet hope. Each day was another step forward, together, toward a future none of them had dared to dream of before that night in the rain, before Emily walked into their lives and changed them forever. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next ones. Leave a like because it helps this story get recommended to more people. See you in the next story.